He was a judge for 35 years. And the day his own son stood trial, he didn't even show up. Hey everyone, real quick before we jump in, the channel's been slowing down a bit, and your support really helps. If you haven't already, hitting that subscribe button is a small way to make a big impact. It's free, takes a second, and helps us keep making the content you enjoy. Thanks so much. Now let's get into it. My father, Judge Eric Lawson, was one of the most respected names in Chicago's legal world. A towering symbol of integrity in a city that has always danced too close to corruption. He spent over 3 decades on the bench, and during that time, he built a reputation so unwavering, so absolute, it almost ceased to feel human. His name carried a kind of judicial gravity, the sort that silenced rooms and caused even the boldest lawyers to straighten their backs when he entered. To many, he was the last honest man in a compromised system. To others, he was inflexible to a fault, the human embodiment of cold justice. But within the legal community, he wasn't just a judge. He was the ideal everyone else fell short of. He raised me, his only son, in the heavy shadow of that identity. Principle wasn't something my father discussed. It was something he breathed. It was etched into his posture, the tight press of his lips, the meticulous way he read legal briefs. Red pen in hand, margin notes like precise scalpels. He didn't bend, didn't flinch, and rarely, if ever, questioned himself. I remember watching him from the back row of his courtroom as a kid, legs swinging from the bench, trying to understand why everyone sat up straighter when he entered. He didn't need volume to command a room. He had presence, like a judge in a black and white film, except real, and mine. His rulings made it into academic journals. His dissenting opinions were dissected in classrooms. His signature carried more weight than most men's entire careers. But the man the city admired wasn't the man I came home to. At home, he was more statue than father, a figure carved from discipline and silence. He didn't yell, he didn't curse. But he also didn't laugh, didn't ask questions, didn't share stories about his past, or ask about mine. He showed up for the basics: tuition, rent, health insurance, tax season. But not for late-night talks or moral crises, or the kind of conversations that make a father feel like more than a bank account. We had a rhythm, but no music.
I'm Alex Lawson, 21, a political science major at Northwestern, though, if I'm being honest, most of my soul is in protest marches, community organizing meetings, and overstuffed campus cafes where people argue about everything that's broken in the world. I'm probably everything he didn't want me to be. Loud, insistent, anti-establishment, deeply skeptical of the very system he gave his life to. Where he sees order, I see oppression. Where he sees structure, I see barriers. Ages takes ago. We've argued more times than I can count, and most of those debates end with him going quiet. Not because he's out of arguments, but because engagement feels too close to emotional risk. And yet, I never hated him. How could I? I admired his discipline, his unshakable code, his mind that worked like a finely tuned machine. I just hated that he kept it all locked behind a wall I was never invited to climb. Sometimes, I wonder if he ever really saw me. Not as a reflection of himself, not as a walking legacy, but as a person, messy, flawed, impassioned, confused. A son who wanted to be understood, not just tolerated. A son who wanted a relationship, not just support. Conversations with him often felt like legal proceedings, precise, clipped, and carrying the weight of unspoken judgment. And yet, despite the formal coldness, there was something there, a thread, a silent promise that if either of us figured out how to speak the right language, the bridge might still be built. To the outside world, Judge Lawson was a monument to justice, firm, fair, and feared. To me, he was a monument too, but one that never turned its head to look back, never bent down to speak my name without a courtroom tone. And maybe that's why what happened later hit so hard. Because when everything broke, I didn't know whether I wanted him to be a father or a judge. And I didn't know which one he'd choose to be. It happened on a Friday night. I remember that clearly because the weather had finally shifted after a brutal summer.
The kind of evening where the air was cool and sharp, with the faint smell of rain in the distance. The city felt strangely calm for once. The heat had lifted, the streets weren't buzzing with the usual chaos, and even the sirens seemed fewer that night. My friends and I had planned a casual hangout. Just a few drinks, maybe some darts, and inevitably another string of heated debates about politics and protest culture. It wasn't anything wild. No drugs, no street trouble. Just a small bar in a quiet neighborhood. The kind with dim lights and cracked leather booths, where students, off-duty cops, and bartenders all ended up in the same smoky room. A place where you could exist without performance. It felt like the kind of night you'd forget the next morning. Until everything pivoted.
There was this guy at the bar, mid-30s, I think. Loud in the way people get when they know no one will call him on it. He was the kind of man who had never heard the word no and taken it seriously. Wealthy, probably. Designer jacket, expensive watch, smug grin that never quite touched his eyes. He kept leaning in on my friend Sarah, getting too close, too touchy, brushing off her clear discomfort like it was part of some twisted game. Sarah's one of the strongest people I know. Opinionated, fierce, self-aware. But that night, she froze. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe the years of being taught not to escalate, to stay safe by smiling through it. I watched her laugh, nervously, try to pull away, and saw that flash of fear in her eyes that I'll never forget. So I got up, told him firmly but without yelling to back off, told him she wasn't interested, told him to walk away. He turned slowly and looked me up and down like I was a minor inconvenience. Then he laughed, a loud, mocking sound that made the back of my neck burn, and then it just happened. I wish I could say I thought it through. I didn't. 1 second, he grabbed her wrist again, tighter this time, and something in me snapped. My hand moved before my brain could catch up. A punch, harder than I meant it to be, maybe, or maybe exactly what it needed to be. He reeled back, tripped over the leg of a bar stool, hit the floor hard. His head collided with the base of a broken wooden chair. The sound it made, I still hear it sometimes in my sleep, a dull, wet crack that silenced the room. Everything went quiet for a beat. Then chaos. People shouted. Someone knocked over a drink. Sarah was screaming his name. A bartender fumbled for the phone. Someone shouted for an ambulance. I stood frozen in the middle of it all. Fists clenched, heart racing, mind blank. I couldn't move. My whole body was locked in that moment, as if I could somehow rewind it if I stayed still enough. They took him to the hospital that night. He slipped into a coma within the hour. He didn't wake up the next day. It wasn't murder. At least, that's what the police said when they questioned me. It wasn't premeditated, they repeated. I hadn't brought a weapon, hadn't sought him out. It was self-defense, kind of. Defense of another, maybe. But the man I'd hit had cracked his skull. He suffered brain damage. Permanent, they said. He would likely never walk again, never speak, maybe not even recognize his own family. I was told I'd acted bravely, that I stood up for someone being harassed, that I'd done what any decent man would do. But the legal system doesn't deal in decency. It deals in definitions, statutes, charges. And I was charged with aggravated assault, resulting in serious bodily harm. That was the night I told my father. I expected, anger, disappointment, maybe even a rare, restrained show of emotion. But he just listened, sat perfectly still in his leather chair, hands folded, expression unreadable. His eyes didn't flicker, he didn't ask questions, he didn't sigh. He just absorbed it all, like a judge reviewing evidence in court. When I finished, he stared at me for a long time. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't as a father. It was as the man the city knew. "You'll have to face the consequences," he said. Then he got up, walked into his office, and closed the door behind him. He didn't call anyone, didn't ask for details, didn't offer to help or explain what might happen next. Just silence. I sat in the hallway outside his office for hours. I don't know what I was waiting for. A sign, a change of heart, some proof that beneath the robe and rulings there was still a father in there. But the door never opened. The next morning, I was officially charged. A lawyer from the public defender's office showed up at my apartment, folder in hand. He didn't say it directly, but I could tell. No one had intervened. No calls were made. No favors were asked. My father had done nothing. Right before the hearing, he said one thing to me in the courthouse hallway without looking up from his notes. "The law doesn't care that you're my son, and neither will I.
That was it. His only contribution. He didn't come into the courtroom, he didn't call when they processed me, he didn't write when I was confined during pretrial. To the world, he remained a figure of unshakable justice. To the legal press, it was a story of rare integrity. A judge who held even his own blood accountable. A man who would not bend, not even for family. They wrote headlines praising him, called him the last honest man, called me the tragic byproduct of an unfortunate situation. But to me, he was a stranger in a suit who happened to share my last name. And yet, late at night, alone in that cell, I asked myself, if he had helped, if he'd pulled strings, covered for me, protected me, would I have respected him less? Or more? Would I have hated him for betraying the law? Or would I have finally felt like his son? I still don't know. Maybe I never will. The trial moved faster than I expected. Maybe it was because the evidence was so straightforward. Or maybe it was because my father's silence removed any obstacles before they could form. There were no delays, no postponements, no behind-the-scenes negotiations. Everything proceeded with cold, mechanical precision, like the justice system was in a hurry to make an example out of me.
My lawyer, a tired, overworked public defender named Green, did what he could. He argued that my actions were reactionary, that I had stepped in to protect someone else, that I wasn't a violent person by nature. He dug through my academic record, my community work, even a glowing letter of recommendation from a professor I'd assisted on a research project. He tried to paint a picture of a good kid caught in a terrible moment. But the facts were heavy and unmoving. There was footage from the bar, grainy, but clear enough. The sound of the man's head hitting the floor echoed through the courtroom when they played it. There were the medical reports, a skull fracture, swelling, long-term brain damage. There was the testimony from his family, his mother's shaking voice as she described who her son used to be before I shattered everything. They sat in the front row every day, his parents, his brother, a girlfriend who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. They never missed a session. Their grief and fury sat on their faces like stone masks. I could feel the heat of their stares burning into my back every time I stood. But I didn't look at them much. I didn't really look at anyone. The courtroom didn't feel like a room anymore. It felt like a vacuum, like I was drifting inside some slow-motion spiral, watching my life get dismantled, one word at a time. I could hear my name, the charges, the evidence, but it all felt disconnected, as if I were watching a film about someone else. The volume turned down so low I could only guess what the characters were saying. Sometimes I'd glance at the gallery, not looking for sympathy, just hoping to see him, my father. The man who once said justice required sacrifice, even when it hurt. The man whose presence had always filled rooms I wasn't invited into. I looked for him in the shadows, in the far back row, in the space I used to occupy when I'd sneak into his courtroom as a boy. But that seat remained empty. I was found guilty. Aggravated assault with intent to cause serious harm. The judge, not my father, of course, but a colleague of his, handed down the sentence. 5 years suspended. Community service. Mandatory counseling. Probation. Restricted movement. A record that would follow me like a scar. It could have been worse, people said. My lawyer, the guards, even Sarah, who came to see me afterward. She took my hand in the hallway outside the courtroom, her eyes glassy, her fingers trembling. "You did the right thing," she whispered. And then I cried, truly cried, for the first time since that night. Not because I was relieved, but because it all felt so irreversible. I didn't feel lucky. I didn't feel spared. I felt erased. When I stepped out of the courthouse, I wasn't a student anymore. I wasn't a son, not really. I wasn't even a convict, in the full sense. I was a shadow of all those things. Someone who no longer belonged anywhere. The name Lawson had weight, but not the kind that helped. Not anymore. And the worst part? My father never said a word. Not once. Weeks turned into months. The phone didn't ring. No letters came. My mother called once. She didn't say much, just that he was doing what he thinks is right. I don't know if she believed it, or if she was just trying to keep the family myth alive a little longer. So I started over, slowly. I volunteered at clinics, helped organize community drives, worked double shifts at the food bank. I sat through every mandated therapy session, trying to say the right things, trying to mean them. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. I met people along the way, real people, people who carried scars of their own
and didn't flinch when they heard my name. They reminded me that I wasn't alone, that mistakes don't have to define you, even if the system says otherwise. But I kept circling the same question, late at night, staring at ceilings in borrowed rooms. If I had been anyone else's son, would the judge have done more? Would he have fought for me, found some obscure precedent, argued for leniency behind closed doors? Would he have hired a real defense team instead of letting me be assigned the next name on the roster? Or was I always meant to be the proof of his virtue? Sometimes I dreamed about him. They weren't nightmares. They weren't even sad. They were quiet, almost tender. We'd be sitting on a bench somewhere, maybe by the lake or in our backyard from when I was a kid. He'd ask how I was doing. I'd tell him. He'd nod. That was it. No big reconciliation, no long speeches, just presence, which was more than I ever got when I was awake. Then, almost a year after the sentencing, I saw him. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was outside the shelter I worked at, sorting through donations. The air was thick with late summer heat, and across the street, standing near a rusted lamppost, was my father, still in his suit, still perfectly pressed. His hands were clasped behind his back. He looked the same, like the months hadn't touched him, like he had stepped out of a courtroom and into that moment without pause. He didn't cross the street. He didn't wave. He just stood there, watching. And I didn't move.
Not because I didn't want to, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I wanted him to cross. I didn't know what I would say if he did. So we stood there, two Lawsons on opposite sides of the street, two sides of the same silence, and said nothing, because maybe that silence was the only thing we ever truly shared. We didn't speak that day. He was gone by the time I turned back from getting water for the shelter staff. No note, no message, no sign he'd ever been there except the ghost of his presence, lingering like smoke on the sidewalk. But something shifted in me after that. Not forgiveness, not closure, nothing that clean or simple, but a kind of quiet understanding. A thread pulled loose from years of tangled silence. He was never going to be the father I wanted, maybe never even the man I had imagined when I was young, but he had come, however briefly. And I couldn't pretend that didn't mean something. Maybe not everything, but something. I kept going because that's what I had learned to do. The routine became a kind of rhythm that stitched the days together. Work at the shelter, group therapy, community cleanups. I started mentoring kids who were one bad night away from making the kind of mistake I had. I helped draft local policy proposals for post-conviction reintegration, even re-enrolled in school part-time, sitting in classrooms next to students who had no idea who I was or what name they were whispering behind closed courtroom doors 2 years earlier. The headlines had faded, replaced by the subtler cadence of rebuilding. Not redemption, that's a word for novels and movie arcs. What I had was motion. Forward, uneven, but motion all the same. Still, I knew it wouldn't last forever. The day would come when the lines we had drawn would bend, when something bigger than our stubbornness would force us into the same space, into the same air. That day came exactly 2 years and 3 months after the sentencing. My father was retiring. 35 years of judicial service, a milestone, a legacy. The court organized a ceremony in his honor, formal, private, closed to the press by invitation only. I wasn't invited, not that I expected to be. I found out through a law student named Darren who volunteered at the legal aid clinic I worked with. He mentioned it casually, like it was common knowledge. Big send-off next week for Lawson. Everyone who's anyone will be there. I said nothing, smiled tightly, nodded. I didn't plan to go. I told myself I didn't care, that his world had always been locked to me, that it would be pathetic to force myself into a room where I clearly didn't belong. But that morning, something gave way. I pulled out a collared shirt, not ironed, not fancy, just decent. Sat on the edge of my bed for nearly an hour, my hands clasped together, like I was praying to something I didn't believe in. And then I got up and went. The courthouse was dressed like a cathedral,
Polished floors, banners bearing my father's name, floral arrangements lining the central aisle, 100 black robes filled the seats. Judges, clerks, legal aides, former students, people who had worked with him, studied under him, quoted him. Family members I hadn't seen since my mother's funeral were there, offering each other tight-lipped smiles and air kisses. I stayed in the back, close to the exit, ready to leave the second I felt like a trespasser. And then he stepped up to the podium. His speech began as expected, formal, composed, modest in that calculated way men like him were trained to deliver. He thanked colleagues, recounted major cases, quoted legal scholars and personal mentors. His voice never wavered, never rose. He spoke like he always did, like he was writing precedent into the air. But near the end, he paused. For just a second. A hesitation I'd never seen in him before. The law, he said slowly, demands consistency. But life does not. In the courtroom, we apply precedent. In life, we carry pain. We interpret context. We weigh silence. Sometimes justice and love are not the same thing. Sometimes, he repeated, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on mine. They live on opposite sides of the street. It was less than a second, but he saw me, and I saw him seeing me. Maybe no one else noticed. Maybe it wasn't meant for anyone but me. But I felt it, like a verdict being read that no one else could hear. When the applause came, loud, sustained, echoing in the high ceilings, I slipped out through the side door. I didn't wait for conversations, or cameras, or closure. I didn't need him to follow. Didn't expect him to. Because somewhere in that moment, I finally understood something I've been trying to reconcile for years. He never stopped being a judge. Not for a day. Not even for his own son. Not even when it tore a chasm between us. He chose the law, again and again, not because he loved it more than me, but because it was the only way he knew how to love anything at all. And somehow, that made the silence between us feel less like abandonment and more like an answer I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. It's been 4 years since the trial, 2 since the ceremony. My name still turns heads in certain places, though less often now. The shadow of my father's legacy is shrinking, not because people have forgotten him, they haven't, but because time softens even the sharpest outlines. New scandals, new heroes, new headlines. I graduated last spring. Political science, same as before, but this time the diploma felt earned. Not just a second chance, a first one, really, one that I built with scraped knuckles and sleepless nights and every ounce of stubbornness I inherited from him. I teach now, just part-time, intro to legal ethics for first years at a community college. Most of them are still figuring themselves out, not yet jaded by systems or cynical about power. I see so much of myself in them, and sometimes, though I hate to admit it, I see flashes of him, too. The way they argue, the way they search for something to believe in. Every semester, I start the course with a question. What would you do if justice and love pointed in different directions? Most of them laugh, think it's rhetorical, but one day, one of them won't. I haven't spoken to my father since the ceremony, not directly. We've exchanged one letter each. His was typed, mine wasn't. I keep his in a drawer. It's short, careful, as if every word was cross-examined before it hit the page. But I know he read mine, because in the final paragraph I wrote, "I don't hate you, I just wish you'd made a different choice." And in his reply, he said, "So do I." And now I want to ask you, what would you do when your heart pulls one way, but your conscience pulls the other? When your love for your child stands in direct conflict with the oath you swore to the world? Is betraying yourself always weakness, or